Howdy, all of you delicious people. I'm here today to review Ouija, Origin of Evil. When immediately I would say Ouija as a film, I would kind of just be like, But then all of a sudden, once I see the word Origins of Evil after that, completely changed. I'm a completely changed man after hearing those words. So we go into this film and I remember when the original Ouija movie came out and people were like, this seems interesting. People were buzzing and people were talking about it. And for me, I just saw it as a joke. I saw it as what are they gonna do? Like Chutes and Ladders and Candyland as a movie. And I feel like with how we have so many wild pitches out there, I feel like eventually, legitimately, that's gonna be a movie at some point to just chuck out there, because everybody's putting their true story out there and people are busting out films, so might as well go on and just make a board game a movie at this point, because Jumanji was a thing. So Ouija, for this movie, this movie really rests on this young girl named Doris in this film. Everything else, there isn't much of a effort put to oh, well, what are the real ghosts of this movie? Well, it doesn't really matter. We just have Doris and she's channeling some people, and beyond the whole fortune telling concept of it, there isn't much we really need to do beyond this film. But at least it feels like this movie doesn't waste your time. There are parts of me during the ending of this film where I should probably actually be scared, and I am laughing. I am chuckling. I am just not taking this movie seriously. And it does have an interesting beginning, and it does have an interesting end. I'll say that in a positive light. But there's too much of me that is saying this is a lesser movie of something. This just feels like Poltergeist. This feels like a Conjuring film, and again, I would just much rather go on and watch those than watch a goofy board game movie, unless it was actually really good. And I mean really good scares, because I don't like cheap scares in a movie, and that's what it felt like a lot of these were. And so really you have to go on, and when you're doing a horror film, you have to have unexpected scares, and those are the ones that immediately win me over. And so I wasn't won over by this film. This movie could probably make you uneasy, but anyways, going on to this film, yeah, it's just I would say it's a bad, but it's not a harsh bad. It's just kind of a bad, but maybe at some point I would probably go on and watch this movie again at some point. But I would still probably laugh during it. So yeah, so as far as that goes, there's not much of me cryptically having much to really profoundly say here. So let's tee this up. What is this movie about? Because currently it's on Netflix. So this movie, of course, via the concept, is to say that we have this fortune teller woman who is to put on this facade of fortune telling, to go on and have these candles that are having all these switches, and every bit of this is to all be a fake or a lie. But then all of a sudden, we go on and have Lena, who is to go to this party one night and realize well, hey, I saw this Ouija board at this party. Maybe this is something we can incorporate. And Alice is sounds like a good idea. And that all of a sudden leads to Doris, like stir of echoing, going on and speaking with all these spirits, like really Whoopi Goldberging it out. That's even a thing. And so we all of a sudden have Doris, who is starting to write out these strange things within this class, to the point to where Father Tom is to have to kind of bring in Alice and just be like, yeah, like, wait a minute, like this doesn't quite make sense. And so the further and further along we go, we have Father Tom that consistently gets incorporated with his family, to the point of him possibly thinking it's like, well, exorcism time. Like, I think I need to go on and talk with the church, and like, I think we should go on and do something. But like, we really go on and never really get that far. Because really, this is just a ghost movie where it's like, you have to figure out how to take this thing out. You got to figure out how to beat it. But you can't go through like a conjuring way and just beat it that way and just like power of Christ compels you and whatever. Like, no, like, you just have to kind of figure out and put the pieces together of how to like defeat this thing. So yeah, so we have a poltergeist conjuring kind of film, and so at the end of the day, Doris is carrying the film, and the ghosts are just whatever they need to be for this story. It is just like, anyways. So yeah. So with that said, kind of in a rushed way, talked about this film in a very cryptic-like sense, because I think it's about that time to just go into spoiler sense about this movie. It's conveniently on Netflix. Go out of your way to watch this movie regardless, because more than likely you'll probably just go out of like, I don't think that you graded this properly. I think that this is movie. And I'm just like, okay. Like, I don't like Conjuring films. Like, I'll admit that. I don't like Conjuring universe films. Very rarely do I have a positive thing to talk about any number of those. But go on and check every single one of them out, because I have a whole playlist of them. Like, I think maybe the Conjuring movies are probably better than all the other ones, and maybe there's some surprises in store with those reviews. But a lot of those movies is like, boo, no, no. But anyways, go ahead and check that out if that's what you really want to do, for whatever. So, with that said, let's still fire this up. Let's just go into spoilers about this movie. It's about that time to just go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about the time again to spoil this movie. Speaking of blowing, that's a weird transition. We have Alice going on and talking with Jenny and Mr. Browning in a session in the beginning of this film to showcase how fake Alice really is. So we go on and have these two coming in here, and Jenny is the skeptic person the whole entire time, and Mr. Browning, of course, to be asking his wife these questions. So we have Alice wanting to channel Mr. Browning's wife, and so Alice is to say like, hey, give us a sign that you're here, and conveniently we have one of the candles that blow out, like, oh yeah, she must be here. So Mr. Browning is to go on and ask this woman questions, and so the first thing that I believe he asks her, it's like, well, hey, are you okay? Like, are things like okay for you where you were at? So, like, are you not in pain anymore? And so Alice is to say, like, well, yeah, like, she's no longer in pain, because I guess she was to have cancer before. And Mr. Browning's like, oh, okay, all right. So they go on and they are to have to continue to ask her yes or no questions, and candles are to either blow out or they're to blow like off and on, to signal like yeses or nos and stuff like that, which I'm like, I'm sorry, I don't know if I can believe like a candle like that's to like not blow completely out. It seems a little weird for me, but whatever. So Mr. Browning is, I think, to ask a second question, which I don't remember exactly what that is. And, like, possibly about some, like, something of their past, like, kind of tying into one another. And then I think Mr. Browning goes on and is to ask about Jenny might possibly be married to this guy, and there's an investment opportunity, and should Mr. Browning go on and do that? And it seems like the answer is no. And so all of a sudden we have this kind of spirit-like thing that is to appear here and just give like the pointer finger, like and so all of a sudden we have Mr. Browning and Jenny, who ends up getting scared. They scream, sounds are to be made, and Alice is to kind of push off Mr. Browning and everybody to leave. And so Alice is to kind of like, hey, like, I'm not going to take your money this time around. So all of a sudden we go on and Alice to come back in to have the kids kind of come out of their hiding place because they were doing all these ruses and whatever. And so Alice is to kind of show like some trickery that she was doing and how all of this works. So they're going on and kind of ridiculing Jenny for like how like a skeptic she was and how like rude she was. And like I think kind of Jenny was suckered into this, so really she probably didn't want to go. And so after that, we of course push on, and within this movie we have of course times when the girls are to go off to school and stuff of that nature. So we have at some points where Doris is to go to school and get bullied by these two guys, and Father Tom is to kind of walk in and try to uh, ridicule these kids that are kind of making fun of Doris and kind of shoo them off. So Alice is to go to meet up with Father Tom, and like they're to have their like nice moment of like, well, hey, like thank you for going on and helping out this girl. And like Father Tom is like, well, like kids will be kids kind of thing. So Alice is to mention about like Doris is to not have a dad, and Father Tom is like, well, yeah, like I talked to her about that from time to time. So we have at some point where Alice is to go out and or no, I got that wrong. Alice is to go on and go to bed, and Lena is to sneak out. And so Lena is to go on and sneak out to this party with a bunch of her friends. And so Lena is to go and realize that there's a Ouija board with all these other board games. And Lena's like, well, like, I don't want to go on and play this Ouija board because I think I've had enough ghosts in my life. And they're like, well, oh no, like, yeah, let's go on and let's play this Ouija board. So they go on and they play this Ouija board and they channel the ghosts and they have to say goodbye and all these like secret words and whatever. to where eventually Doris has gone on to say these words so many times when she used to use this Ouija board. At one point, she used to like half say the words, and she's like blah blah blah. Like, come on, like. So Lena is to go and do this Ouija board, and is to like have her like guys go and do this in a circle 4 times because there are 4 people. So the first question that, of course, is to be asked is to, of course, have Mikey ask if Lena is going to go on and have him take her to the homecoming dance, which the answer was yes. So Mike kind of reconfirms with Lena. It's like, well, like, are you sure it's a yes? And like Lena's like, well, yeah, I think I'm attracted to this guy, and it seems that there may be a point where they try to kiss, but then Father Tom, of course, separates them. It's like, hey, do you have enough room for the Holy Ghost? Because of course we would go on and see certain movies where like kids are dancing and they're dancing far too close to one another, and like we've had certain parts where eventually fathers would go on to be like, hey, do you have enough room for the Holy Ghost? Because you guys are dancing and you're dancing far too close to one another. So we have Lena that is to continue to go on with this Ouija board session, and it seems that they ask this ghost, it's like, well, hey, like, what is it like in the afterlife? And the thing ends up saying cold. It's like, okay, makes sense. So we go on and we have certain characters thinking, it's like, well, hey, you're moving it. No, you're moving it. And we have one girl who is very scared, and she's like, I don't know about this. Because, of course, you always have a character in the group that always has to be very like, I don't know. I'm scared. So the more they ask this thing questions, the more they decide, like, you know what, like, let's kind of leave this be. So they have it at one point where Alice is to make her way to where Lena is, and so like Alice is to drive Lena back home. And so Lena is to mention that they were to go on and play with this Ouija board at this party, and maybe Alice should incorporate that into her act. So Alice decides to go along with it, and she buys this Ouija board, and she figures out that she can put magnets on her thighs to connect to the table and be able to kind of move this thing around to kind of have it like answer the way like she wants it answered. But we have at one point where Alice is to start asking questions, and Doris and Lena, who's in another room, Doris is starting to answer them. Alice is to mention, like, well, hey, is Roger here? And Doris is to say no. And Alice is like, well, what spirit is here? And Doris is to say Marcus. And so Lena is asking Doris, is like, well, hey, like, what are you talking about? And Doris doesn't answer. So Alice continues to start asking like yes or no questions, and so it seems that Doris is answering. So we have Lena kind of weirded out by that, and then when Doris to kind of break the connection as Alice is to go on and no longer ask questions, Lena is to just kind of ask Doris, like, well, hey, like, what were you doing there? And Doris is like, I don't know what you're talking about. So we go on in this movie, and there's like a number of things that end up kind of playing out throughout this story. Like, there's the one point where Lena is to realize that Doris is to sew up her doll's mouth, and so Lena is to have this one dream that she's going on into her bathroom, and all of a sudden she's looking in the mirror, and all of a sudden she's like Matrix like sewing her mouth shut. And so Lena is like freaking out, and she ends up waking up, and she's like, "Oh my god!" So we have at one point where the family is to come home one day, noticing a foreclosure thing on, of course, their house. And once they realize, like, well, I guess we're gonna have to find somewhere else to live. Doris all of a sudden is to have this bag full of money that she is to conveniently find, and Lena and Alice are like, well, hey, how did you come into this money? And Doris is like, well, like, I went on and someone told me to pull out these rocks from this hiding place, and there was a stack of money there. And so Alice is like, oh my god, well, I think I can go on now, and I think that we can kind of keep this house. Because Alice and Lena were talking about, like, man, like, it would be sad for us to lose this house because Roger wanted us to live in it. So all of a sudden, since Alice is to have seen Doris, like, have somebody tell her where the money is, and so now they're kind of approaching this Ouija board and having Doris possibly, like, have ghosts talk to them. So Alice wants to try and channel Roger. So Doris goes on and is to eventually answer some Alice questions. So Alice goes on and she's like, well, like, hey, like, Roger, are you here? Yes. And so Alice is like, well, when I was to, of course, be pregnant, where was the place that I told you at? And so eventually it spells out shower. And Alice is like, well, that's weirdly correct. So we even start to have the Ouija board starting to move on its own. And so Alice starts to freak out. And so it's like, well, yeah, like, I guess this thing's legit. So it seems we go on, and Doris is to take some time away from school because, like, it's kind of like a little concerning about this girl who has this ability to talk to ghosts. So Father Tom is to bring Lena in and is asking, like, well, hey, like, seems like your sister has been gone for 4 days. Like, is she okay? And Lena's like, well, yeah, like, she's just sick. And we have the Father Tom that's like, okay. So we have, I guess Doris, who eventually goes back to school, even though she doesn't really want to go back to school. She just wants to stay here and talk to her friends, because Doris at one point is to use the Ouija board and, like, ask, like, well, hey, like, who is it that I'm talking to? And the thing, like, tells her it's just a friend. So Doris doesn't really like school all that well, so she kind of wants to stay here and just talk to all these people and eventually write down all these things that aren't actually her writing all these things. Because at one point, Father Tom is to bring Alice in to ask Alice if someone is helping Doris, like, try to advance in classes. And Alice is like, well, no, because why? And Father Tom is saying that's like, well, it seems that Doris is now writing in cursive. And so Alice and Lynn are asking, like, well, hey, did you teach her how to write cursive? And it's like, no. And so Alice is asking Doris, is like, well, hey, where did you, like, get this cursive from? And Doris is just like, well, Like, I let a friend help me, and I let her just kind of write this out. So we go on, and we also have Lena, who's to see another thing of writing being done by Doris, and this writing feels very like weird. So Father Tom at one point is to take Alice to this dinner to just kind of talk things out. So when Alice and Father Tom are to go to this dinner, at some points, we have Father Tom talking about him being a priest, and there's sometimes where he kind of second guesses that decision. And we have like Alice like talking about her husband, and like Father Tom is talking about his wife that had died. So Lena, after this whole thing, Lena is to bring Father Tom these letters that Lena is to weirdly think that, like, is this like Polish? Like, this must be Polish. I'm like, well, like, what? Did she have like Google Translator? How does she know Polish language? So Lena is to give Father Tom these letters that her sister has been writing in Polish. And Father Tom is like, well, there's not probably anybody that really talks like Polish here, but maybe I know like some nun who might be able to like figure all this out. So after Lena is to give these papers, we then have Father Tom wanting to stop and meet over at Doris's to say, it's like, well, Father Tom before like didn't want anything to do with possibly getting any closure moment to do any fortune telling, but Alice is just like, well, like if you want any like kind of, if you want to talk to your wife, like maybe like we can arrange something. And Father Tom is like, well, I kind of feel like anything that I was to like think about my wife or talk about or want to talk about my wife, like my wife would know. Uh, like my wife is possibly still there somewhere. So Father Tom finally reconsiders and wants Doris to like do this whole session. So Father Tom, of course, is now asking what the maiden name or middle name, of course, his wife had. So Doris to mention Lynn, and Father Tom was like, ah. So the next thing, of course, talking about an argument, and like there seems to be like the argument that they try to swerve away from, and so also like it seems that Father Tom's wife is to mention that like, hey, you don't need the collar to uh like you can go on and not have to like have the collar, like you should be happy and stuff like that. So after Father Tom is to go on and have this session and speak with Lena and Alice, he is to tell them, it's like, well, my wife's actual like middle name or whatever is Catherine. So they're like, well, yeah, like that's, so you're saying that she's like faking, she's like she's lying about all this. And Father Tom is like, well, no, because in my brain, in the very first question, like I was thinking Lynn the whole entire time, pushing Doris to then say Lynn. But then when the second question came up, Father Tom kind of cleared his brain, and like Doris couldn't answer it. So Father Tom is thinking that this girl has some kind of power of sorts, but like he can't really put his finger on it yet. So when Alice was to go on and have this dinner with Father Tom, Lena was to invite, of course, Mikey to come back to her place. And we had Alice, who was to, the first time around, see Mikey and was to like palm read him. And she goes on and is to like mention like, oh, like this is your lifeline and this is your this and this is your that. So Alice to go on and put her nail like through this guy's hand almost and to threaten him. It's like, well, yeah, and if you put your hand anywhere on my daughter, like you're gonna lose it or you're gonna die. Your lifeline is gonna be way shorter than it should be. And Mikey's like, yeah, I get it. So, and when Mikey goes on and is to be in Lena's room and then kind of walks out because Lena and Mikey are kind of just listening to music, Mikey is to talk to Doris, and Doris is mentioning about like thought I just sneezed for a moment there. Uh, Doris is mentioning about like strangling to death and how that is to really feel. Because I guess one of her spirits was to go on and know what it was like to get strangled to death. And so Mikey is hearing all of this and is like, okay, this is so bizarre. And after that, Mikey is so uncomfortable with Doris that anytime he's with Doris in this movie, he's like, like, I don't know if I really want to be around this girl. So, because Mikey eventually, towards the end of the film, is going to re-show up at this house again. So Father Tom is to go on and be convinced there's something wrong with this girl, and Father Tom is to also get these letters translated. And come to find out, there is this Polish guy who is to mention about everything that was to happen to him in this Polish war, and mention how his friends died and then how he died. And so come to find out, the location of the place that they had died in was within this place. That it seems that there is some secret location within this house that these bodies are still laying in. And come to find out, while Lena, Alice, and Father Tom are all talking, Mikey comes in again, and Doris is to, of course, take Mikey to this location nearby this furnace where Doris had gone on to collect the money from earlier. Doris, and I want to get to this before I get to what is to go on next. Doris, of course, was to have a session where she was to talk to some woman, and she was to ask about her lover or her loved one if they still love her, and Doris is to say always. But then weirdly, she was to have this neck problem. And so Doris is to talk to Lena about her neck problem. So Lena is saying like, well, hey, just kind of take some medication and hopefully like rest, and like maybe you'll be fine by tomorrow. Or if it seems to get way too bad, then maybe like we'll wake up mom and rush you to the hospital. So Doris is just kind of saying, it's like, well, I don't know, it feels like a sting, it feels like, I don't know, it's something. So Doris is continuing to sleep, but she can't sleep because her neck hurts. So eventually she goes to this mirror, and at some point we have this kind of scene like how we see here, where this ghost is kind of tilting Doris back and is to now like possess this woman and take full control. So now, of course, we have Doris who's talking to Mikey, and Mikey is kind of pulling these rocks aside, and he is to now start pulling things out of this hole. And Doris is to mention that she had left some jewelry in there for Mikey to pull out. But Mikey all of a sudden is to pull out this doctor's bag that has all these like identifications and like this doctor's equipment and so on and so forth. And so Doris goes on and is to whisper ghostly sweet nothings into a number of people in this movie, especially while they're sleeping. Doris is to go on and whisper sweet ghostly nothings to Lena while she's sleeping. And Doris is to, I guess, take control of Mike and possess him also. So we now have it where like Father Tom, Alice, and Lena are to realize that the more and more that all of them are talking about what they're going to do next in this house, because Lena is to figure out, it's like, well, hey, like, if all these ghosts have lived in this house and they're still haunting it, and like really like we're not getting like the actual like Roger or the actual like whoever to really go on and be talking to us here, maybe like these ghosts are just hearing everything and they know exactly how to answer things because they know certain people or they know like what had happened in this house. So they're saying, hey, whatever we are planning, we should get out of this house and try to plan it. So all of a sudden they go on and they start looking through the house to find where Doris is, because they're just like, okay, where is she? So all of a sudden we have Mikey, who is to be noosed up and falls, and we're just kind of seeing now Mikey just hanging around, pun unintended. So they're like, oh my god, like I guess like yeah, this is really happening now. So they go on and they decide to go into the furnace, and their master plan is to take the Ouija board and to burn it into the furnace, but also Father Tom is to want to like take these stones from the place where Doris was to find this hidden batch of money. And so Father Tom pulls these stones out and is to kind of poke his head in there and light this match, and is to see all these skeletons. And Father Tom is like, well, yeah, like there's a bunch of people all buried here. So at first, everybody all wants to stick together because that seems to be the master plan. But then Father Tom is to hear through this ventilation shaft that Doris is consistently talking and asking for help. So Father Tom is saying that he'll go in there, and Alice and Lena, you just kind of stay here. So Father Tom goes in there and is eventually to see this room that has this record playing this music. And so how is it that these people didn't know this whole thing existed? Not quite sure. But so Father Tom at some point is to talk to Doris, and he is to try to like power of Christ compels you, and really like that isn't going to work with Doris. That just really isn't going to, like, there's no, like, exorcism that seems that is going to work for Doris. So, Doris is not only talking in her voice, but then also the spirit's voice at the simultaneous same time. So, we of course, have Doris, who at some point is to like whisper sweet nothings into Father Tom's ear, is to be able to possess him. And so Father Thomas goes back through the ventilation, and they're like, well, like, did you see Doris? Like, is she okay? So all of a sudden, Father Thomas is to whip out this knife and is chasing both Alice and Lena. And so they're like running for their lives, and so it seems that they go on and they close this door. And because at one point Father Thomas was to almost lose his control and kill Alice, but then he like retains his control and decides to like drop this knife. And what ends up happening is Father Thomas ends up getting like killed at the steps, and he dies. Like his neck ends up getting snapped. So Lena and Alice, we have, and here's where like I start to laugh or it really gets goofy. When the point when Alice is to be kind of just like pushed away by this ghost, and Lena is to also get pushed in to a direction where all of a sudden Doris is doing this like Spider-Man like thing. That's when I started to honestly just laugh in this movie. There were some goofy things that they were doing in here. And we also had Mikey, who is still like hung there, but he also all of a sudden is like doing this kind of like this hanging thing, but he's also going on and like grabbing people, and like he's in on this also. So we go on into this film, and eventually at some point it's all to really get us down in that basement. So we go on, and Doris is doing her Linda Blair thing, and is doing this like this conjuring thing, and so they're possessed thing. And we have this back and forth where it seems that Doris is going to possess Lena, and then Alice is like, well, take me, like, and Alice is just like, well, like she's like a better vessel. She's like Lena is better than Alice. And so Alice is just like, well, like just take me, like whatever you need from me, like cut it out for me, like I don't care, just take me. And Doris is like, well, we're gonna take everybody anyways. So Alice goes on to be put into the basement, and so Lena is to have to kind of save the day here. So eventually Alice is to get possessed, and what ends up happening is Lena is to have to like defend herself and stab into her own mother and kill her own mother off. We also have Lena that is to have to go on and realize that her father was to give her some kind of clue to solve all this. That Lena is to have saw that her doll was to be like sewn shut, and Lena is like, oh my god, like that's the answer. So because the answer is to try to get rid of all the voices, and what better way to get rid of all the voices but sew someone's mouth shut so they can't talk. So Lena goes on and gets this sewing needle and is like sewing up her own sister's mouth so all the voices will go away. And all these like ghosts are trying to get nearer and nearer to Lena, and they're trying to like prevent her from like sewing, and so they're like and so Lena is trying to like consistently just like sew up this girl's mouth. And so I guess after the sewing up of Doris's mouth, I guess Dora is to turn into this ghost. And then after Lena is to deal with her mother and stabs into her and kills her, at this point Lena is the only one left of this family. all of her other family members are all dead now. So cue us up having Lena, who's at this mental hospital where like she is to consistently talk about her family or her mother or her sister, and like the therapist is trying to pry information out of Linda about what all happened, and Lena is to just kind of just be like, oh, well, no, what? Like, my sister? Yeah, my sister. Yeah, my mother. Yeah. Like, there's nothing that the girl really says, I guess, out of the deep trauma of it all. Um, like, we can go on and have this girl who had her whole entire life flash before her eyes. But so, Lena, once she goes right back to her room to kind of sleep this off, Lena is to pull the carpet from her floor and is to bust out in blood this Ouija board, and Lena is trying to channel and try to talk to her family or her sister. So all of a sudden we have the therapist making the rounds and just kind of checking on things. And so this therapist is to all of a sudden see into Lena's room, where it seems that at first, like, there may be some kind of ghosts in Lena's room. And then the therapist is like, what? Like, let me go back into that room. And so Lena is to be like right by the door. And the therapist is like, oh, okay, maybe I was seeing something wrong here. And all of a sudden, Doris is now walking on the ceiling and is coming after this therapist. And like that's the way the movie supposedly ends. But then again, we have an end credit scene that some people may not know about. So the end credit scene is to, of course, have Lena as a much older character. This is to be Lena from 2013. And all of a sudden, Lena is to hear the fact that she is to have this nephew or relative of hers, and so she like turns and she's like, oh really? And like that's how the movie just kind of stops, because end credit scene. So with that said, in a very roundabout way, I think I covered most of this film. But then again, there's probably a lot of stuff that I left out. So without a doubt, let me know in the comments below what those things were, because at the end of the day, I love comments. Because I know there's probably I know immediately once I go on and I cut this off, I'm gonna be like, yeah, there's like 30 different things that I didn't mention. But yeah, like we had the sewing of the doll thing where Lena was to call Doris out and probably sewing up the doll, and Doris didn't do it. And so come to find out, like, we see Roger, their dad, who was to go on to do it. So really telling us how to like solve this whole puzzle and so on and so forth. So yeah, some good things in here. Yeah, at the end of the day, I think I'm just gonna go out of my way to just get on out of here, because this is far long enough for almost an hour and 40-minute movie. So I'm gonna get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.